Welcome to the Phish Bowl. We are your hosts. I'm Mike Kosak.
And I'm Stephanie Schneider.
And each month we'll be taking a plunge into cybersecurity threats, from nation-state activity to cybercrime trends and general cybersecurity issues that we are tracking as cyber threat intelligence analysts. We're back each month getting our passports stamped as we travel around the globe and provide a threat overview for different regions. Check out our previous episodes. If you're new here and haven't had a listen, this is the first time we're coming back around this cycle. So far, we've covered Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America, and now we are back where we started. We'll be taking a look at the APAC region this month. And we're also going to be talking about, we're going to have an update on the infostealer threat landscape and talk through some recent activity from China. And for our special guest this month, we'll be having a conversation about the cyber threat environment with Katherine Mansted from CyberCX.
Well, instead of trick-or-treating this month, make sure you don't get tricked by infostealers, because some ransomware doesn't knock, it just sneaks in and grabs your digital candy. Think things like passwords, cookies, and credentials. And this month we have an update for you all, kind of revisiting what the global infostealer landscape looks like following the coordinated takedown of the Lumma stealer back in May. So we've been tracking infostealer threat activity, and when Lumma was taken down, we were curious to see kind of what would happen, and we did predict that there would be probably some comeback, and some disruption to the infostealer landscape as well, and we did see that. So, but I think Lumma did surprise the broader community, because it has actually come back and has shown that it is quite resilient. Even within days of being disrupted, the Lumma operators were able to start rebuilding their infrastructure. There's been a gradual but steady resurgence in operations that we've seen. And the developers claim that their central server is located outside of the geographical reach of U.S. law enforcement. So it was only temporarily disrupted and wiped, so not totally ceased. So that's why we saw them able to come back online relatively quickly. And to evade future takedowns, Lumma has also shifted its infrastructure from Cloudflare to alternative providers, most notably the Russian-based Selectal. And again, that's just to, be out of reach of any law enforcement. And Russia is notorious for not being the most cooperative with taking action against shutting down malicious activity or cybercriminal activity. That's not to say that Lumma's back to the levels that they were at before they were disrupted. Mike, what have other infostealers been up to?
There's certainly been a lot of activity. I mean, it's been interesting. To your point, Lumma certainly was more resilient than we've seen with other infostealers. Like, if you think about the Raccoon infostealer takedown or the Red Line, like that, pretty much, they're still kicking around a little bit, but that pretty much put them out of business. But to your point, Lumma has proven to be quite resilient, which isn't surprising given the robustness of their operations. They're highly advanced and capable. But we did see a shift where a lot of other infostealer families moved in to try and pick up the gap. So one that first appeared in February and then really took advantage of that disruption to Lumma was Accreed. This, for a while, really rose up to become the leading strain for credential theft logs on Russian market in particular, surpassing other established infostealers for a little while, actually, at least with some of the stuff we're monitoring. Other infostealers, such as Radamanthus, are also vying for market share. We track this really closely, of course, because, obviously with the overlap with credentials, and I'll say for the last couple of weeks with what we're tracking, we've seen them kind of move into first place for what they're offering up on the marketplaces. So that's really new and really unique. And even this last week, and we're recording this October 6th, so that, that last week of September into October, we saw them move in and take up almost 50% of the credentials that we were monitoring. So really a big difference and a real strong disruption. This isn't, and again, this isn't particularly new. This is a sort of pattern that we see time and again with these takedowns. I mean, that's how Lumma rose to prominence. Was Redline and Raccoon were taken down, and then Lumma rose up. So really, just kind of see that keep playing out over and over again. But Lumma again, really just showing that resiliency by sticking around much better than those previous takedowns.
With the time we have left, I want to talk about China and specifically some of the recent developments and reporting around their espionage activities. There was a recent advisory that a bunch of different government agencies signed, warning that Chinese state sponsored threat actors are targeting networks globally. And this activity isn't really new, but it is the most broadly endorsed advisory that we've seen. The Five Eyes signed on, so US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But I think it's notable that in addition to that, several others signed as well, including Spain, Finland, many others. And the advisory really focuses on uh, kind of outlining and going into detail about China's campaign targeting telecom providers. They're also targeting transportation, government, military infrastructure. And they're probably doing this to track targets, conduct cyber espionage. They're really big into collecting big data so that they can just kind of siphon up as much as they can and then, analyze that and track intelligence, dissidents, things like that. So really just trying to collect as much information as possible, and getting their foot in the door, collecting information. In some cases, they're also likely pre-positioning themselves so that they're able to disrupt services or communications in the event of an active conflict, should that eventually arise at some point in the future. And how they're doing it is they're going after routers of major telecom providers. We've seen a lot of reporting recently about that coming out, more specific information about certain providers that have been targeted. They're also targeting routers, and they're trying to maintain persistent long-term access to complete those objectives I just talked about. The advisory also calls out that they're taking advantage of vulnerabilities, which we see China do a lot, and also collecting credentials to allow them to move laterally once they gain access into systems. And they're also exploiting weak credentials to access router devices.
Well, you mentioned, Steph, the China using vulnerabilities, and multiple reports show that China does this, really exploits more 0 days than any other country, and this isn't surprising. It's, uh, it's fascinating to me. They have basically created a legal structure within China now that is designed entirely to funnel these 0 days into the government before they're reported anywhere else. So it is, the law, that if a security researcher discovers a 0 day or some sort of vulnerability, they have to report it to the government before they report it to the affected company. So when you think about typical responsible disclosure, where you reach out to the company, you let them know, you give them a good period of time, usually 90 days, it can depend. But roughly 90 days to fix a vulnerability, provide a patch, get it out there before the reporting comes out. It's different in China. It's the antithesis of that, really, where it's go to the government first. They can weaponize it. They do weaponize it, and then use that. And now there's other reporting recently that shows you can. I think it was Gray Noise just did a really good report, that brings in how they've detected an increase in scanning for certain tools that as a prelude to the announcement of these vulnerabilities. So what's probably happening based on a lot of this is these vulnerabilities are found by security researchers. They're funneled to the Chinese government. They're then weaponized. You see this sort of scanning to prepare for a campaign. And then you see these sort of campaigns targeting, usually, to your point, network devices. Cisco, Fortinet in particular, are often targets of this, so that they can get their foot in the door and then go from there. Either exfiltrate data, set up persistence, whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most blatant examples that they're doing this is the Tianfu Cup, which is an annual Chinese hacking competition where cybersecurity researchers find and demonstrate new vulnerabilities. It's often compared to the pwn-to-own hacking contest in the West, except vulnerabilities must be disclosed to the Chinese intelligence apparatus instead of to affected vendors first to the government. And so, they're pretty much able to use that however they want before, if ever, those vulnerabilities are disclosed.
Yeah, they'll use these for a number of purposes. Of course, sort of the classic cyber espionage. A lot of the stuff we've talked about, either on this podcast before or generally just with Salt, like the Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, and these sorts of campaigns trying to infiltrate critical infrastructure. But a big part of this as well is IP theft. So, this is highlighted too by Mandiant just released a report highlighting a campaign of IP theft and a larger Chinese campaign around trying to steal information related to the ongoing trade tensions between the United States and China. Um, but uh, but as part of that, there's this intellectual property theft that China's is has been doing now for years, very closely associated with for a number of reasons. One of those reasons, and this is really interesting to me, and it is interesting for I think anybody practicing threat intelligence to note because it gives them kind of a strategic leg up when they're looking at whether or not they could be targeted by China. Their operations, especially around IP theft, typically align with their 5-year plan. So the Chinese Communist Party comes together every 5 years. They establish a 5-year plan for where they want to see the economy go, what the investments will be, where they want to see the advancements. Um, we're in the 14th 5-year plan right now, and there's a very high correlation. There's been a lot of reporting on this by a number of different companies, Mandiant, for instance. But there's a very high correlation between what sorts of companies are targeted for cyber espionage and intellectual property theft, and the very industries that are called out for investment and advancement by the Chinese Communist Party in these 5-year plans. So, you see this with energy, you see this with telecommunications, you see this with technology sector in general. As part of the 14th year plan, it's interesting to note that the Chinese Communist Party will be meeting later this month to discuss the 15th 5-year plan. So that will be coming out relatively soon, and will again give cyber threat intelligence analysts and really, cyber espionage, any sort of intelligence analysts, a real leg up on what sort of things they should be monitoring and tracking, and what industries need to be concerned. So any organization can read that. It's out for the public once it's released, and know whether or not they could be in the crosshairs for some of this activity.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about, nation state actors conducting cyber espionage, we don't really think about the business impact of what that means to businesses and how corporations are also targeted and caught up in that, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's the Australian government, working with their some of their criminal agencies, just put out a really good report a month or two ago that starts to put a real financial cost, and it's one of the first reports I've seen like this. It really puts a financial cost on intellectual property theft specifically as related to cyber espionage. So, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, along with the Australian Institute of Criminology, found it was costing the country about 8 billion US dollars or 12 billion Australian dollars a year. And that cost is split between the actual IP theft loss itself as well as response costs. So that's not a small amount of money. That's a massive impact. And that's just one country alone. So if you parlay that out globally, that just shows the impact that this has.
Yeah, it's really interesting to get this insight and actual hard numbers to look at because it really does link that financial cost, showing that it's not just affecting the government, it's not just a government nation state issue, but it does impact the private sector and give some good hard numbers to just kind of put that into perspective.
Well, let's move on to our conversation. So we are lucky enough this week to have Katherine Mansted, the Executive Director for Cyber Intelligence at CyberCX. Thank you very much for joining us this week, Katherine.
Awesome to be with you, Mike.
Well, I am actually in region right now as we are recording this. So, as we do our reports, our regional reports, we rotate through region by region, and so this month happens to coincide with APAC as we are here. I guess, just to kind of start the conversation, I'd love to know from your perspective, what have you seen as far as general trends for the region over 2025, and then even where you think things might go in 2026?
The $1 million question. Well, I'll start with the kind of obvious observation that we all like to say in the industry when we nod to the problems that face us, that the cyber threat landscape is deteriorating. Mike, it's worse today than it was yesterday. It will be worse tomorrow. And I imagine that trend will continue, alas, over 2026. But what's driving that? So, some of the things that we've noticed in the team and we're really tracking and interested in um, firstly, in the cybercrime world, a lot of turbulence and volatility. So much has been made of law enforcement disruptions of cyber criminals, which is always a good and welcome thing. But what we continue to see is you take the head off the snake and several new heads grow in their place. And in some sense, our cyber criminals are becoming less predictable and more dangerous. So we've seen certainly across the Northern Hemisphere a big return back to disruption, ransomware. Of course, everyone's talking about Jaguar Land Rover, Asahi in Japan. But even here down under, we've noticed that whatever honor there was amongst thieves in the cyber extortion realm has started to dissipate. They're less reliable, less trustworthy, simply, I think, because they don't expect to be around tomorrow. They're more disrupted, they're more volatile, they're more prone to infighting, etc. So that's not a great thing. What we've also seen as well is the rise and rise of different classes of threat actors. Now, I'm sure we'll talk about our favourites in nation states and maybe in insiders and, of course, cyber criminals in a moment. But we're also thinking about down here our ideologically motivated hacktivists. That wasn't a very cool thing to talk about a couple of years ago because they were seen to be kind of mildly irritating, not that skilled. But we've seen hundreds of incidents affecting Australian and New Zealand organisations, sometimes at the big end of town, critical infrastructure, sometimes small to medium enterprises. Nothing too particularly disruptive. We're talking DDoS, website defacement. But in this world where information war is just as prevalent as cyber war, and the reputational impacts of cyber incidents can be so acute for organisations, we're also really taking quite seriously this global ecosystem of hacktivists as well.
That's a great call out, Catherine. And I'll note too, we're seeing that, within the US, we're seeing a rise of that. And there has been sort of this cycle, to your point, where, I think a lot of people did move on because they figured that it was more an annoyance than anything. But especially with what's going on in the US right now, we see this rise of hacktivism again, and particularly targeting and doxing law enforcement with a lot of what we're seeing around ICE in the US right now. And certainly with the other global conflicts that are going on, you see more activity around that. I'm not surprised to hear that. And it is, you do tend to see them, as you pointed out, targeting kind of the low-hanging fruit oftentimes. Like I know within the US, and we often see targeting of um, town websites, municipality websites and stuff like that for website defacements and DDoS because they lack the defenses, they lack the infrastructure. So it's interesting to see that those TTPs replicate across regions.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think a lot's made as well. Or many of the claims of these activists are inflated. There's great reporting where they claim to have affected or disrupted OT, operational technology systems, and they more than likely haven't. But I think we ignore these trends and kind of dismiss them at our own peril because I'm sure, again, another trend you're watching is the commodification of everything, cybercrime in particular, and the fact that the barriers to entry into some pretty nefarious things are lowering. Add a little bit of AI to something, and you can make it easier and cheaper to do. So I think as well, we'll see hacktivists potentially more well equipped in future, and certainly they're collaborating, coordinating, and getting better at their craft if I can call it that. So it's definitely something, it's not the most important thing, but it's something that we watch. And I mention it because I think sometimes in the industry it can get dismissed. But it is not the most important thing, but a thing to watch.
Yes, very much so, and I'm glad you called that out, and to raise awareness on that. And so, what else do you think? When you mentioned cyber criminals, you mentioned nation states. Where do you think those are pointing in the future, and what sort of activity are you seeing now?
Yeah, so look, at a macro level, a couple of observations. So in terms of our nation state actors, I mean, the gloves are off, right, in cyberspace. We can go more detailed into the TTPs and the kind of the fun technical bits, but I think at a really high level, one of the things that's occurred to me over particularly this year, probably the last 18 months, 2 years, is that sabotage is kind of normalized in international relations right now. So what do I mean by that? So we've got revelations that the Chinese government is pre-positioning in critical infrastructure, certainly in the US, but also our intel agencies here and cyber industry here is warning that, it's quite likely we would see that activity or that activity is occurring in Australia, New Zealand as well. But it's not just China, Russia, in both the physical and the cyber realm. And I love this quote. The head of MI6 in the UK has said that Russian intelligence services have gone feral, conducting a reckless campaign of sabotage across Europe. So non-combatant states, not part of the direct confrontation or war between Ukraine and Russia, but diplomatically involved and logistically involved in supporting Ukraine. That's a really different world than the world that we maybe inhabited a couple of years ago, where we see sabotage of the private sector often and the private sector in non-combatant states outside of direct conflict zones being something that governments think is okay.
Yeah, that operational preparation of the environment is something, as you mentioned, we've certainly seen here in the States quite a bit. And I think you really nailed it with pointing out how the world has changed in these sort of acceptance and normalization of that. I know, and when I've spoken about it previously, in some instances, it's when you think about some of the implications as far as impact on the real world. When we look at what China is targeting between energy sector and telecommunications sector, and the potential for, if those were fully disrupted and targeted with some sort of destructive cyber attack. Um, that's almost tantamount in a way to planting a physical bomb and leaving it there within the borders of another country, just as far as the potential impacts of that. And the fact that that has been, to your point, normalized is such a strange development within the cyber threat environment.
We've seen countries like Russia who have been doing hybrid warfare for so long with information operations, but countries are becoming, to your point, a lot more bold and aggressive in the cyberspace. And I don't really see there being a whole lot of, punishment or there, I guess they see that it's being effective for them to operate in this space. And there's not really a whole lot of strong countermeasures that have been put in place to push back.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think you could say that all foreign governments here are fundamentally undeterred. In fact, if anything, a couple of years ago, we talk about the big bad four of cyber, thinking in a Western lens here, but you talk about China, Russia, North Korea, Iran as those engaged in malicious state-sponsored activity. But if anything, that panoply of bad guys is expanding. There are more authoritarian-leaning governments now that are incorporating malicious cyber activities into their toolkit, disruption, espionage, tracking dissidents, etc. That's interesting, right? Because if anything, the club of wrongdoers is expanding. And I think you could also say that China, Iran, Russia, North Korea are becoming increasingly risk tolerant and reckless in how they use malicious cyber activities. What we've seen across the world with the Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon campaigns is something we've really never seen before in terms of its scale, but also it is a little bit reckless, I think, because, of course, China does not like being caught out. But I think they're a little bit more tolerant to being caught out in this area than they ever were, because the gains they expect from espionage in the case of Salt Typhoon, or pre-positioning for sabotage in the case of Volt Typhoon, far outweigh the risks of being caught with their hand in the cookie jar.
Well, just last week, the Australian Signals Directorate released their annual cyber threat report. Catherine, what were some of the takeaways for you from that? Some of the things you found interesting, some of the trends that really stood out for you.
I think the top line trend is that more and more organizations are proactively, and individuals are proactively phoning in cybercrime and cyber incidents to the Australian Signals Directorate. And on the flip side, the Australian Signals Directorate is doing more in terms of proactive outreach across critical infrastructure and across organisations, the private sector more generally, to give them a heads up about potential malicious cyber activity on their networks. And I think both of those trends are interesting, right? So the first trend goes to the underlying deterioration of the threat landscape. We have every 6 minutes a cyber crime reported into ASD in this country, and there's been a slight uptick year on year from the last report that they did. But also, I think it's showing more awareness, more ability to identify and detect malicious cyber activity from the private sector. So that's actually a good thing. We don't get optimistic much when we're talking about cybersecurity. That's a thing to hang our hat on. But the other point, that ASD is doing more and more outreach back into the community. So its notifications to critical infrastructure are up something like 111% year on year. I think that also shows a change in the regulatory and the legislative footing in Australia that's letting ASD communicate more freely with the public. So that's our Australian Signals Directorate. And in a way, particularly that critical infrastructure is not worried about the legal implications of that. There's kind of a protected communication channel where they can talk about just the nitty-gritty of cyber defense without worrying about legal ramifications down the road. So clearly that's working really well and increasing that industry government intelligence sharing, which is only a really, really good thing.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I was really struck by that as well. As you said, there's not much to smile about within cybersecurity, but seeing that engagement and that forward-leaning engagement from ACSC and ASD is really heartening, especially within the United States. We're kind of on the other side of that hill right now, as Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is contracting in many ways, and sort of withdrawing some of their connections with the private sector in particular, and the public sector as well. But it was really heartening to see that and see the impact of that. And I listened to Lieutenant General McGuinness speak last week at CyberCon, and to hear her talk about the idea of uplift, not just within enterprise size organizations, but small and to mid-sized businesses, and even just among the general population. It's such a positive development to see, and I give a lot of credit to ASD for that work.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, so just to take it from the macro down into the nitty gritty, what I thought was really interesting were the tactics that were being used for cyber criminals, but also nation states. And this is something I know you talk about a bit on this podcast, but number one was phishing. We all know that. But number two, about 30% of incidents were starting with compromised accounts as well. So there's also an underlying trend there where we're seeing phishing, social engineering kind of declining as the initial access vector in terms of overall percentage, and the rise of stolen legitimate credentials. So the macro level, lots happening, but also a lot you can take away from the kind of tactical observations as we prepare for 2026 as well from that report.
One of the things that the ASD annual cyber threat report called out was ransomware attacks and data breaches, and that these are just really increasing in frequency. And when we look at the threat landscape, we see a lot of, critical infrastructure, you mentioned, like businesses and healthcare, telecos being hammered. And, we did some research as well, looking into the types of companies in the Asia Pacific region overall who are victims listed on ransomware data leak sites. And we found that it's primarily companies from Australia. They made up of almost 20% of victims by country, looking at year to date. Manufacturing was also up there, and then a lot of SMBs and mid-size enterprises, which typically have less robust defenses compared to larger corporations. I guess the question to pose is, in your opinion, what should businesses be doing right now to ensure that they're protected against, ransomware threats, data breaches, which are so prevalent, and just making sure that their defenses are shored up just across the board?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly reflect on your stat set because we at CyberCX track dedicated leak sites obviously really closely in our region. And I joke that Australia is a top 10 destination for tourism in the world, but also a top 10 destination for cyber criminals, which when you think of the size of our economy, we're punching above our weight, weirdly, in the volume and scale of cyber attacks here. So one of the things to think about really closely is supply chain, because as you mentioned there, Stephanie, it's often small to medium enterprises that are the starting point for a lot of ransomware, data theft, extortion cases. It's not the four walls of the big critical infrastructure organization that are compromised. It's their upstream supply chain, IT, contractors, etc. So that's one thing that's it's a difficult problem to confront. I think the other one is you can't protect what you're not monitoring, you're not measuring, just basic kind of logging. We continue to see gaps globally, but also in Australia, particularly in the kind of mid-market, small to medium sector. And then the final thing, just to think, if we're thinking in a future lens, 2026, what does this look like? Across broader APAC, we are seeing that some jurisdictions that previously were less targeted, they were less digitally mature, for example, finding themselves increasingly on the radar of cyber extortion groups, because as we get more resilient in developed economies in places like Australia, business model of cybercrime doesn't go away. It just shifts left. And of course, we're only as good as the broader ecosystem. We're only as safe as the broader ecosystem that we operate in is. So that small to medium sector, really important to uplift, but also partners across the region. We don't want to address our cybercrime problem or diminish it here and only just pass it off to developing countries that are rapidly digitalizing across our region either.
Well, thank you very much, Katherine. I know we're running out of time, so very much appreciate your time and sharing your insights. You're welcome back anytime, and thank you again.
An absolute pleasure. A great conversation. Thanks all.
That wraps up our episode of the Phish Bowl. If you like what you heard, make sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you don't miss new episodes. Thanks again for joining. See you next time.